morning, everybody. Welcome to trial day 8. This will be the summary for trial day 8. First on the stand brought up by prosecution is Christopher Albert. Christopher Albert lived down the same street as John O'Keefe, and he owns a pizza shop within the town, and he does know John as a neighbor and as a friend. Okay, as we were talking about this a while ago, they have Christopher Albert on the stand right now. He's been on there for already an hour and a half. Looks like he'll be on there for a good 2 hours. They've had a lot to ask, and I've had to actually go back and reference some of the other testimony from the past few days since we are at day 8 today. So to give you an idea of who Christopher Albert is, he lived down the same road as John O'Keefe. He is also the brother of Kevin Albert. Kevin Albert is the cop whose property John's body was found dead on. Chris Albert, the one who's on the stand right now, he is one of 5 town selectors. So he actually had to run for office and had people, as positions go, you run for office, you take campaign money from people, and so on and so forth. So he is actually one of the 5 selectors for the town. Chris Albert has lived in this town, the town of Canton, since he was 4 years old, he said. And right now, currently, his parents live across the street from the police department. Their son, Kevin Albert, the one we were just talking about, he is a police officer. The Albert family is well known in Canton and has deep roots. Chris was asked and he agreed to these descriptions. Part of the testimony that I found interesting right now is he was asked if he knew Michael Proctor's sister, and he had said for about 20 years. He had testified to that and answered those questions from prosecution. And when it was time for defense to cross-examine, defense asked that question, like, you've been friends with Michael Proctor's sister for about 24 years, and prosecution objected. And defense tried to say, like, okay, but he brought this into the trial himself. He just acknowledged this a while ago in cross-examination. However, being the judge has been acting the way she has, she allowed him to ask again in a way. And when he did, the prosecution objected again, and it was at this point that Judge Beverly told the defense to ask the next question. So she just didn't want to let this continue, and she ended up sustaining the question. Pretty shady behavior, considering prosecution themselves brought this information into the testimony, into court. So you are then allowed to question that information. But she wasn't going to allow that. They're also talking about Kenneth Berkowitz, and he is the former police chief. Chris knows him. They've known each other for a long time, and their children play on the same team. So, as I was saying, Kenneth Berkowitz is a former police chief, and Chris has known him for a long time. So Kenneth is also photographed with Chris at his campaign, as Chris also agreed that Kenneth did contribute financially to his campaign for when he ran for this town selector's position. Chris refers to Kenneth Berkowitz as Kenny. Defense has made comment that he must know him well enough to call him by Kenny and not his first name, Kenneth. Chris also agreed that they do have personal and professional relationships with each other. Okay, as we were talking about, Brian Albert is the police officer whose property John was found dead on. Brian Albert is Christopher Albert's brother. They also showed pictures within this trial of Christopher and his wife, Julie Albert, holding drinks and taking drinks over to John's house, to his property, and standing on his property holding the drinks and showing him that they were on his lawn. According to Christopher, he said that John had him watching his property while he was out of town, and so they thought it would be funny if they went over there and took pictures of them on his lawn. Also, Chris and his wife, Julie, referred to John as Never Cracker, quote unquote, which is a character from some movie that they also mentioned, but I don't remember what movie it was. And this particular character didn't like people to be on his lawn, and they found that this was a good description for John because he didn't like people to be on his lawn. John also stated that his wife, Julie, has John's number in her phone saved as Never Cracker. After Christopher got off the stand, Julie Albert, his wife, took the stand. Now, if you can recall, Christopher Albert is the one that owns the pizza shop, so him and his wife, Julie Albert, own this shop. They were both at the Waterfall bar that night. Now, after the incident, Michael Proctor, who is a police officer, was the one that went to question Christopher and his wife, Julie Albert. The problem with this particular officer, with Michael Proctor, is that Christopher has known him for a long time, since they were 12 years old, is what he said. And a further problem with this is they weren't questioned until 2 weeks after the incident. Michael Proctor, this officer, is the brother of her good friend Courtney Proctor. One would ask how good of a friends they are, which prosecution did. She admitted that Julie herself is taking care of Courtney's children. She took care of her kids 2 times a week. And there were many other incidents that showed the closeness of their relationship. However, of course, when the questions were asked, prosecution objected and the judge sustained the objections. One of the sustained objections was that Julie's son was actually in Courtney's wedding, or vice versa. However, the problem with that whole relationship that comes in is when Julie was being questioned, she said that her and Courtney Proctor weren't that close of friends. Karen Reed was arrested on February 1st, and on this particular date, Julie Albert talked to Courtney Proctor for 12 minutes on the phone. This was brought up and questioned because Julie had claimed earlier in her testimony that her and Courtney weren't that close. She said that they talked very rarely. However, that is why defense was asking her, okay, on February 1st, when Karen Reed was arrested, so this wasn't televised yet, no one knew about this yet, except for law enforcement, Julie talked with Courtney over the phone for 12 minutes. And defense asked Julie what that conversation was about, and she said she didn't know. Well, the first couple of questions defense asked, prosecution objected to. Of course, the judge sustained the questions, and finally defense asked what was the, just to be not specific then, what was this conversation about? And Julie said she doesn't remember. Defense's belief in this situation is that Julie was using Courtney to communicate with Michael Proctor, the officer who had interviewed them about the case. So she couldn't remember the conversation. She was shown phone records that she did have this conversation. She said okay, but she doesn't remember the conversation. Julie herself said she was aware that Karen was going to be arrested that day. How she knew, you're left to just figure that out on your own, because anytime the defense asked these questions, prosecution objected and the judge sustained those objections. So based off that information, you can come to the conclusion yourself. She clearly had somebody on the inside giving her this information, because this wasn't known publicly just yet. And it actually wasn't known until the following day, which was February 2nd, when Karen was arraigned publicly. And remembering at the same time that Julie has said she very rarely ever talks to Courtney, yet on February 1st, she talked to Courtney on the phone for 12 minutes. And then the following day, on February 2nd, Julie was again talking to Courtney on the phone. She actually talked to her prior to Karen being arraigned at 9 a.m. So she had already made several calls to her prior to that morning, and then again spoke to her after the arraignment. And after the arraignment, she spoke to her for 27 minutes. So during that February 2nd, that one day, she had spoke to Courtney 3 times. For somebody who rarely talks to her, I don't know, seems kind of suspicious, don't you think? There was quite a bit of suspicious activity that took place between the Alberts and the Proctors that day in regards to Karen Reed's arrest and arraignment. Defense was questioning pretty hard and getting some pretty good information during this last couple minutes of trial, and the judge stood up and just ended court for the day. So we'll see where things go. Stay tuned.